Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Folks, welcome back to the show. This is your host, Pat Flynn. I have the mighty, the magnificent, big Pete Groehler joining me today. Welcome aboard. Welcome on again, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me as always.
Yeah, so our conversation today will probably traverse many different topics as usual. We've had a lot of good discussions recently. By the way, I just want to make a mention that Pete now officially has his own podcast up. It's called The Right Side of Things. Looks at contemporary events through the lens of Catholicism, conservatism. Pete, is that available? That's up on iTunes and everything, right?
iTunes, Google Play, wherever your podcasts are sold, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely check that out, friends. The more sort of Catholic viewpoints that we're getting, especially on contemporary events, the less we have to try and discern truth from former newspapers like the New York Times. And that's always an easier job for us, isn't it?
Yep.
Oh, Pete. So aside from contemporary issues, what's going on in the old spiritual life? Any new things you've been working on, reading about, interested in, studying, practicing?
Yeah, I mean, from our current musings, like I said last time on my show, you are the scalpel and I am merely the humble sledgehammer, so to speak. You are far more suited to the philosophical realm than I am, so I'm trying to brush up, reading a little bit more and all that. You wrote a great article for your website, Chronicles of Strength, about the truth of truth, and that kind of, really, really struck me. And while it may be a little bit above my level, so to speak, and I commented on it and I said, we're seeing a strong death of the fairy tale. And I'm reading a book right now called The Story Killers, about how the postmodernist left has done a great job of destroying the fabrics of literature and the fairy tale. If we look at what literature was meant to do, is it was supposed to drive us towards an understanding of truth. The basis for a story, if we go all the way back, in the days when Beowulf was written, is the gods and monsters literature, so to speak, was supposed to get us to a truth and an understanding of morals. The soldier sitting around the fire isn't going to necessarily crack open Socrates or Aristotle and start getting into the meat of existentialism. It's going to go way over his head, and that's like a lot of us, and kind of what I try to do with the right side of things is get into the marrow, so to speak. And that's kind of what drove me out of teaching, was the postmodernist idea that, truth is nothing. There is no such thing as truth. Or
let's talk about that. I think that could be a good, at least a launching off point for our conversation tonight. Who knows, maybe we'll take up the whole time. Because first off, it's just a great question to ask people. Jesus was asked this question, wasn't he? What is truth? What is truth? And it's like, to me, that's the question. That's it. Right. And I guess one of the biggest problems that's going on today, it's been going on for some time, it's not that people don't even think deeply about truth. It's just they don't even seem to care about truth anymore. It's like, on one hand, the part of the problem is you have these wackos, these weirdos, that often get lumped under this term of postmodernism, which is really an eclectic collection of often
Fallacies.
of self-contradicting, self-refuting philosophy. So it's actually a very difficult project to really say exactly what postmodernism is. You can give a lot of examples and stuff like that, but it's not an easy thing to you can't distill it in just a couple of sentences. And part of what I try to do in that article is go through a number of claims that you'll often hear people within the sort of postmodern philosophy or social justice philosophy make, especially about truth, and show you why they're as silly as they sound. So you have that bunch that they are just they're as dumb as they look, most of them, and then you have a whole bunch of other people, far more in terms of just quantity, perhaps even the majority of people who just don't care about truth. They just don't seem to. I mean, like, it's not like they don't care. Like, they want to know the truth. It's like, hey, well, you want me to tell the truth, or you want me to be lied to? They're always going to say, well, I want to know the truth. Like, everybody cares about truth in that sense, but they don't seem to be kind of they've been very well conditioned out of the hunt for truth. That sort of that transcendental yearning for truth, which is, I think, a very real and very big problem. So there's two battles that you have to kind of fight. One is against the postmodernists, so the people who would deny that there's any such thing as truth. So we can talk about that. I think we do. And the other battle is like getting people just hungry for the truth again. And like, okay, like the football game is cool, but like you're going to die someday. And like you're here on planet Earth. You're alive, you're conscious, like this miracle of existence going on. And the number one thing you care about is a score between, two people trying to put a ball in an end zone. Like that's what's got your attention the most.
Right.
That's sad. That's confusing. Yeah.
Right. And there's a poet somewhere in the 1700s during the Enlightenment that says, as soon as we undertake bipedal motion, of course he says it in a more poetic way than that. Mm-hmm. He says, as soon as we take our first step, we're one step closer to the grave, always. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Duke once, I was in his class. I hope to get him on my show and hope to get him on yours. He's kind of a hard man to contact. He's got a lot going on. But I was in one of his classes once, and he's like, they build these great palace workout facilities for you guys here on this great college campus. While I was there, they spent something like $4.5 million on a new athletic complex for all the students to use. Mm-hmm. He said, I'll walk in there occasionally. I play basketball, shoot around occasionally, and I'll see you guys on the treadmill. And it's like, no matter really how hard you work, you're going to die someday. I mean,
and it could be a lot sooner.
Not to kind of come at you, because I know you have a physical fitness background, and I mean, in certain respects, so do I. But it's a reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, my job, whenever I do talk about or teach fitness, isn't, it's like I'm not going to stop people from dying. Hopefully, I can help them with living well. It's just a big kind of difference there. But you're right. Like, come on, maybe we just need a little bit more existential dread. That's kind of the problem. Like, we somehow evaded nihilism. We just replaced nihilism with idle distraction somewhere. So it's just I don't know. It's a mess, man. But let's back it up. Let's talk about this idea of truth. I'm glad that article. I got a lot of good feedback on that article, because a lot of people haven't thought about that. Haven't thought about truth much of what is truth. And in philosophy, this is a pretty fundamental question. We try to get working theories of truth up. I offered a sort of minor defense of what's known as more or less a correspondence theory of truth. And the position that I take is that, like, hey, like, there's nothing all that tricky about truth. There really isn't. Truth is telling it like it is. That's right. Right. Truth is when, if you want to be more technical about it, is when the informational content of a proposition matches up to what is the case of when what you say aligns with what reality is. That's truth. That's, again, not that much trickiness about it. And to the extent that you attempt to deny that there's a such thing as truth, as many of the postmodernists do, you immediately get into philosophical difficulty, to put it lightly. Really, it's just an absurdity. I mean, the idea or the claim that there's no such thing as truth, or there's no such thing as absolute truth or objective truth, is notoriously self-refuting. Because is that true? Is that absolutely true or objectively true? And if somebody admits that it is, well, then they've just refuted their own position. If they say that it isn't, then you don't need to pay attention to them in the first place. So what are you doing here? Get out of my office. It's just so any type of it's one of those things. Like, God's not a dummy. He knew what he was doing. Like, he knew when he set up reality, God knew that you would not be able to reason against him. Right? All truth is ultimately God's truth. All reason ultimately is a power granted to us by God. So you're never going to be able to. A stream can never rise higher than its source. Right? You're never going to be able to. If you're reasoning well, a good metric of reasoning is that your reasoning should bring you closer to truth, which, of course, the highest truth, the complete truth, is God. God is an unrestricted act of understanding. God is that sole, ultimate, necessary reality that, in principle, can answer every question that we could ever have. That's who God is. Bernard Lonergan, a famous philosopher, made that very argument for the existence of God, as God is an unrestricted act of understanding. So I think that that's kind of what I push people to think about. Is like, hey, a good metric of accurate, consistent, precise reasoning should always bring you closer to God. And of course, that's what many of the great church fathers were so bold and famous for outlining. Aquinas being one of them. So what I do, and chime in at any second here, Pete, is I kind of continue on this ramble. I'm trying to remember back to what I wrote in that article. I can't believe I forget it was only like a week ago. Is, you go through some of these claims of the relativists, right? The postmodernists, relativists, and you see that the foundations are incredibly shaky, and their foundations are an attack on literally foundationalism. They're just trying to undermine the philosophical foundations that we all pretty much know a priori. I mean, they attack reason itself. They attack logic itself. But you can't even do that. You can't even argue against reason without reason. You can't argue against logic without trying to use logic. So they end up turning themselves in a circle. And then they come up with all these other, you press them on this, and then they come up with all these other bizarre scenarios and say, okay, well, maybe truth is just not what we think it is. Maybe truth is created by sentences. And you're like, really? Dinosaurs never existed before somebody wrote that sentence, before somebody spoke that sentence, and never went extinct? Or
never mind the fossil records, millions of years old.
Well, I mean, like, these positions are as silly as they sound, and this is the stuff that's floating around in academia. Or think about this: if truth is created by sentences, and AIDS is true now, well, then
certainly sells a lot of books, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, like, if AIDS is true now, then let's just erase every sentence that has to do with AIDS, and then that problem should be solved, right? Like, sounds a lot simpler than all the time and money we're spending in other efforts. Or erase everything having to do with slavery, or sometimes they'll even say very odd things about, truth is whatever your peers or colleagues or other people will let you get away with saying. It's like, okay, well, then let's just not let anybody talk about, AIDS is a good, the classic example, or like, you're so, you want to make amends for things that happened in the past. Well, why don't we just stop talking about those things, and then we don't have to make amends for anything because it never happened, right? So not only are their positions just absurd and self-refuting, they often go right back around to undermine many of the very things that these people agitate for, 5 minutes later or previously in their conversation. So it really is. And I had an interview with a guy, I don't know if you listened to it, Pete, Professor Rechtenwald. He's at NYU, and he just, of course, he got attacked for speaking out against this stuff, as is typically the case. And he was on the left, far left. The guy's like a Marxist communist. And he said he finally had his social justice tipping point where he said, okay, this is just actually insane. So he talked out about it. He got, brought forth in front of the diversity committee or whatever, the inclusion committee.
The kangaroo court.
No, like talk about like nothing, like the way he described it, Pete, like it was no conspicuously different than a Stalinist apparatchik, to be perfectly frank. And so he got his for that. They called him every nasty name in the book. They pressured him into a leave of absence and so forth and so on, just because he said that, hey, this is nutty, guys. We need to like knock this off. But I mean, he's a professor of this stuff. Like, he lived postmodernism. He contributed to the problem himself. So he knows its history, and he knows.
And now he got run out on the rails.
Yeah. So he knows the history of this stuff was, again, literally meant to seed destruction in Western society through various institutions. This is a political ideology. It is not philosophy. It is meant to do what could not be done from the top down, from the bottom up. Right? That's what postmodernism meant to do. Communism, Marxism failed as a top-down regime. Magnificently failed, catastrophically failed. So postmodernism is a type of reaction against that, of trying to seed the necessary bad ideas that would bring down Western civilization. And I said to Professor Rectoval, I said, unfortunately and eerily, they've succeeded to a very large degree. Now, the question is, will people hopefully wake up in time before because there's no doubt that it will die, but how much damage will it do before it does die, just like communism did before, just like Marxism did before. So that's sorry, Pete, I just threw a lot out there, but give me your thoughts on it.
Well, one of the things that, strikes me nowadays especially is these people come out and say, well, real communism hasn't been tried.
Oh, really? It has. Really? Has.
And it's like you said too, is how much damage is it going to do before it goes away? People love talking about the fascists, right? Mussolini and Hitler killing, 6 million some odd Jews and gypsies and all that. And everybody remembers the Holocaust, Not many people really have – the history books tend to forget, what happened on the radical left with communism, the Bolshevik revolution, it's called the dekulakization of Russia after the communist revolution, is with the collectivist farming. People were hoarding a little bit of grain so they could survive, and it's, you talk about, you and I have talked before in fitness about the Pareto principle. Is it's, the 10% of work you do is going to contribute 90% of the results. So 10% of the farmers were these kulaks. They were farmers, the farming class, clawed themselves out of serfdom under the czars, and were really starting to make a life for themselves, super mega farms of the day before, the modern inventions of farming. So they were doing really good for themselves. Then all of a sudden collective farming rolls around, and they essentially go around and steal all these people's crops and send them off to Siberia. You know what happens when you get rid of the people that are producing 90% of your food? You starve to death. And under Stalin and Khrushchev and how all the communists, millions upon millions of people died. And then, no one talks about Mao either, the biggest killer of anyone.
Been conveniently forgotten of all the, the atheistic genocidal maniacs. Yeah, he's gotten somewhat of an easy pass in recent years, hasn't he?
True. And college students especially wearing T-shirts around with Che Guevara on them. Arguably one of the biggest killers of Catholics in the Western world.
Yep.
And have absolutely no idea, because getting back to what you were saying is, no one wants to seek the truth nowadays. And, C.S. Lewis talks about this in the Screw Tape Letters too. And I use this in one of my recent episodes on kind of a follow-up to our previous conversations about, backing your politics into your religion. And he talks about, Wormwood is wondering whether, because Lewis was writing this during World War II,
Mm-hmm.
and he said, essentially his nephew, the trainee, is asking him, do I make this guy into a pacifist, or do I make this guy into essentially a war is good for Britain and all that stuff? And he said, whether it doesn't really matter what you make them, as long as you see the religion as nothing more than a political end. Mm-hmm. My religion only serves me in my patriotism or my pacifism, and it's that ungodly, the God's essentially the state at that point, so the devil's really gotcha.
Yeah, Pete, I mean, to that I would just say amen, as I do to most of Lewis's great works.
I said a lot there, but...
Well, the Screw Tape Letters, if people haven't read those, I mean, first off, everybody should just read everything from Lewis, just as everybody should read everything from Chesterton, as far as I'm concerned. Where's like the Lewis and the Chesterton of these days? I mean, but here's the great thing about both of their works: holds up extremely well, just as relevant, if not more relevant now than ever before. And the Screw Tape Letters are also just an absolute hoot. I mean, there's no way that you just can't. I mean, no matter what perspective you're coming from, there's no way you're not going to enjoy reading those.
Right. It took Lewis argued that while writing that was the darkest place he's ever been.
I believe it, and that's how a lot of great works of comedy are. They're produced often by sad clowns, as they say. Lewis struggled a lot in his life. I mean, did you ever read A Grief Observed?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, wow, that was tough. That was tough to read, but I mean, what an amazing piece of work that was. Anyway,
whatever question you have about your faith, if you can't find an answer in Lewis, Tolkien, or Chesterton, and then go to Aquinas and don't find the answer, you didn't have a question in the first place.
Yeah, where you just actually didn't read any of them.
Right.
I think Lewis gets, and we'll come back to the idea of truth here in a minute, and maybe lift the tone a little bit. But yeah, Lewis, he was rigorous. He was not only rigorous in his arguments. I mean, the beginning of Mere Christianity, for example, he really developed very nicely, your kind of basic moral argument, not only for God's existence, but for monotheism out of pantheism, and does just such a great job of it, of being both rigorous and accessible. And people just enjoy his writing so much they don't realize often how good his philosophy actually is. Mm-hmm. But it's top notch. So yeah, truth, what the heck? People don't really care about it anymore. And now, how do you wake people up to they care about, their political party winning, but why? Why? That's the thing. What I try to get people to do, on my other podcast on here is just keep hitting the why button, right? Spam the why button in life. Like, well, why do you want your political party to win? Oh, this is okay. Well, why does that matter? Why does that matter? Why? Eventually you're going to get down to a really juicy question that actually is important. Right, that actually matters. And that's where I would say the fun begins, and that's where the goodness starts. At those biggest metaphysical questions about life, that's where you got to start, right, at the foundations. And this was true in the scholastics, kind of metaphysics always came first before epistemology. And I think that's right. I think that's true. Like we got to try and answer the biggest questions first, about God, God's existence, God's nature, so on and so forth, because that's, how you answer that question is going to have enormous consequences on everything that follows from it. So on a pragmatic side, on a practical side, how do you get people to consider these bigger questions. God knows, like literally God knows, right?
Right.
And what one can trust that he has ordered the world in such a way to try and bring the maximum number of people into a relationship with himself. But given the free will people have, there's a challenge there. There's a real challenge. I think suffering plays an important part in that, unfortunately, right? Sometimes it takes great suffering in a person's life for them to finally start asking the important questions. I think we can all relate to that either personally or think of examples in our life where that's happened to other people, where something really tragic or unfortunate happened. But because of that, they started to dig a little bit deeper. They started to move away from the superficialities. I'm sure you probably relate to that on a few levels, Pete.
Right. I certainly do. And that was kind of what started to lead me back to Catholicism, is kind of that deconstructivist argument, so to speak, is, I started asking myself the why questions. And I think in my first episode with you, my coming out, so to speak, we talked about, how do children start gaining knowledge as they start asking the why question? I'm sure with your 3 children and, owning your own business and kind of working from home, so to speak, you get that question almost endlessly. Daddy, why can't I have cookies for breakfast?
Mm-hmm.
It's that reasoning, that wonder of children that we've really start to do away with as adults because we really think we know better.
Yes.
But in all honesty,
or because we're conditioned out of it too. I mean, I think, and a lot of this is the parents' fault because they themselves either were conditioned out of it, so they pass that on. They say they're silly questions, or they just give really crappy answers. I mean, kids ask the best theological and philosophical questions, and unfortunately, they're not given great answers. Right. Yeah, sometimes it's ego, whatever, it doesn't matter. I already think I know, and I really just don't know anything. A lot of it's conditioning. You're absolutely right on that, Pete.
Right, and I mean, do we really know better? Obviously not, because you have to do the work of writing articles on truth, and I'm really looking forward to your upcoming book. And I follow your wife too. If your listeners don't, the Catholic Mama podcast by Pat's wife Christine is outstanding in kind of getting down to those kind of daily musings, and I love her pictures with your kids. She
does a really nice job with that page.
Right. The whole getting the kids to bake and her talking about her anxieties over things being a mess and a sink full of dishes. But, finding joy and discovery, I think, is, one of the big things too. And, I personally, being a cradle Catholic, I was kind of lulled to sleep, so to speak, with this postmodernism. And my first episode on my podcast, I talk about coming back to my faith through tragedy of losing my brother, and really reaffirming what I believe through that yearning for discovery. And and you talk about kind of Chesterton's musings or Aquinas' musings about, the Catholic faith having essentially everything you need, from origins to, you have this far more memorized than I do.
Yeah, origin, meaning, morality, destiny. Those are the biggest questions. And right, so we have like the big 5, as I sometimes like to say, like, where do we come from, right? Who are we? Why are we here? How are we supposed to behave, and where are we going next? So those are the 5: origin, meaning, morality, identity, and destiny.
Right.
And like those are the questions that everybody should be trying to figure out. Like, what other questions are more important than those? And those are the questions we all want to know on the deepest Like we have the soul's upward yearning, right? These transcendental desires, but they get suppressed. They get conditioned out of us, through school, through the media, through distractions such as sports, politics, so on. And it's dangerous. It's spiritually dangerous because these are the questions that we should be driving into the ground intellectually. And yes, Catholicism answers absolutely all of them. And I would argue, and I have argued many times before, that it is the only creed on market, so to speak, that can answer these questions completely, adequately, and to our satisfaction, to a way that seems right, that gels with our basic intuitions of kind of what we already know. And that you can't discount that. You can't discount that kind of the feel of rightness or the ring of truth, so to speak, on a very deep existential level. Catholicism gives that to us. You contemplate, other creeds, other religions or non-religions, and it just kind of, put aside the arguments against them, put aside the intellect for a minute. It just doesn't feel right, a lot of them. You know what I mean? It just doesn't feel right. Take atheism, right? Which we've made the intellectual case of its absurdities many times, but it just doesn't feel right that we could all just be an accident, that we really aren't what we feel we are. You know what I mean, Pete? Right. There's a certain intuition that really rebels against everything that atheism implies. And I would say, and for good reason, that intuition is there because it's supposed to be there. This is start to get into the proper basicality of belief, of reliable faculties, which the Christian religion, specifically Catholicism, supports, which atheism can. So again, the greatest answers to these why questions not only can be rationally, intellectually answered by Catholicism, but they click. They sort of snap right into place with our intuition, where we get this kind of this deep satisfaction from them. I want to make it seem like life is all humpty-dory once you answer these questions to become a Catholic. But there is a certain satisfaction and joy that becomes unlocked when you finally take the time to go after these questions and really pursue them all the way through. And as I'm sure both of us would agree, Pete, to the extent that somebody is going to do that, it's going to bring them right up to the baptismal font, hopefully, preferably by this Easter Sunday.
Right. Our CIA is still recruiting. That being the rite of Christian initiation for adults, which is a powerful and powerfully long mass. But I was an altar server, and I used to do that all the time because I really believed in it. You get the whole gamut. Mm-hmm. Baptized, you get your first communion, and you get confirmed right there on the spot.
Yeah, I don't know if you know that. That's what Christine did last Easter, man. She did the Easter vigil, got dunked and everything. It was really an incredibly beautiful ceremony. Long, but as it should be, as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
So far as I'm concerned.
If the listeners haven't been to an Easter Triduum Mass, it's really an incredible experience because my former church with my parents, they used to they'd black out all the lights, and they would start a bonfire outside.
Yep.
And you would walk the candles into the church, and Christ is the light of the world. And what a great promise. We talk about the trappings of nihilism and naturalism and things like that. Mm-hmm. If all we're gonna do is live till we die, what a promise, of. And Christ to come into the world and say, I will prepare a place in my kingdom for you if you take up your cross and follow me. Taking up the burdens of truth, so to speak. And like I've said before in our talkings, Christ was liberal, little L liberal. I've called it before, not to confuse it with the somewhat confused political side of the aisle. but little L liberal in that, love your neighbor as yourself, do good to those that persecute you, and to have the promise of the resurrection. And you've made the point before to, if God exists, and has a purpose for us, what a travesty for us to live our entire lives and
That's right.
Actualize that purpose that's been set before us.
And I think, and I think that is something that can open people up, if they are skeptic. I mean, just consider that question. Just say, okay, just consider the possibility, say, that God exists and that he has a purpose for your life. Just even considering that. Why? The fact, however minute this person may think the possibility is, so long as it even remains a possibility, why wouldn't you do everything that you possibly can to examine that possibility? Because yes, I mean, I think you said it exactly right, Pete. The greatest tragedy that you could imagine is not dying of cancer or losing a loved one or withering away in the throes of dementia. Like, those things are terrible, of course. But the greatest tragedy is that there is an objective meaning and purpose to your life and an eternal destiny, and you missed it. You ignored it because you just weren't interested, or you just didn't care, or you were too hard-hearted. That's the greatest tragedy that could ever be imagined. So maybe that's our ending note. We were talking about, how do you open people up to this? I think that I've had some success with that, and that seems to have resonated with a number of people. Just kind of popping that out there, no matter how skeptical you are, no matter where you're coming from, just imagine that this is a possibility, and that many people have believed this. Many people who are smarter than any of us ever have absolutely affirmed this and lived their life by it. It's a real, so however minute, however small you think that possibility is, examine it. Because imagine the consequences if you missed it. That would be the greatest shame that any person could imagine. Pete, thanks for joining me again, my friend. Always a pleasure talking to you. And folks, please do pay Pete a visit over at the Right Side of Things podcast. I know, Pete, you've got a Facebook page going up. What can people expect from you in the future? Give them a little teaser.
I just hope to continue to talk about current events. Like I talk about in my intro, we look at your world through the lens of conservatism, Catholicism, and Christian apologetics. People don't, like we said at the outset, they struggle to merge their Catholic religion with the ways of the world and what they see going on. And I have an episode there with Pat about, where we really need to start thinking about things in our political world is through this lens of truth that we talk about. We go through moral epistemology and moral ontology and where that should lead us. So, I hope to kind of branch that out and talk about more politically expedient things in the future. But I think I've laid a good groundwork, and we'll see some very interesting things in the future.
I would say so, and always good to have another voice out there. Offering the right side of things, Pete. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll talk soon.
All right, thanks for having me again.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.